With the Nintendo Switch 2 coming out very soon, I think it would be fun to look at the original Nintendo Switch as a whole and discuss what its legacy is going to be like. How will people look back at the system? It's been praised and criticized in various ways, so it makes sense that the answer is also somewhat multifaceted. So we're going to take a look at how the Switch will be remembered by collectors, its position within Nintendo's history, as well as how it influenced the gaming industry, among other things. For Nintendo overall, the Switch was a great success. After struggling with Wii U sales, Nintendo really managed a resurgence in sales with the Switch. Many people were confused with the Wii U, thinking it may be an add-on to the Wii, while others wished you could just use the tablet controller as a portable console. The Switch realized that wish while also making it clear that it's a brand new system. Something notable about the Switch is it's the point where handheld and home console gaming came together for Nintendo. They've been toying with this idea for a while now. You may remember stuff like those add-ons you could get for the Super Nintendo and GameCube that allow you to play, Game Boy games on those systems there. And even the Wii U had the ability to play DS games with the TV being the top screen and then the tablet controller being the bottom screen. But the Switch unified that completely. The whole point here is that there's just one development path. Developers don't have to decide if they want to go handheld or home console when it comes to their games on Nintendo systems. That meant we got full-size games that could be played on the go or in handheld mode around the house or whatever, while also bringing mainly handheld IPs to the home console, which gave them a massive graphical boost. For me, the second point is the main one. I really loved the fact that Pokémon was finally a home console series as well. And if I wanted to play home console games on the toilet, I can still do that. Fire Emblem was another series I think that benefited nicely from that. Interestingly, Zelda managed to keep its 2 tiers of games intact. So, for example, Link's Awakening, that was originally a Game Boy game, and it was remade in that cutesy art style, while Echoes of Wisdom was an original game that utilized that same art style. The main open-world Zelda games obviously existed as well in parallel. And then you can totally see how the open-world Zelda games would be the home console games, if they still had separate hardware, right? And then Link's Awakening and Echoes of Wisdom, those would be like the handheld games. So it's interesting how they still retained those 2 tiers with that series. Whether Nintendo will ever go back and split its product line, we don't know. It does seem unlikely. Obviously, a handheld-only Switch exists too, but that's just a version of the normal hardware that, it's smaller and it can't be docked. The point is, it's not a separate piece of hardware with its own development path. Another thing the Switch will be known for is putting Splatoon on the map. Splatoon 1 on the Wii U was very popular, but very popular. What can that mean in the context of the low sales of the consoles, right? But when you look at the install base of the Switch, that really allowed Splatoon to thrive as a series. So much so that we even got 2 games, Splatoon 2 and 3 obviously. And just so you know the numbers there, Splatoon 1 sold under 5 million copies, while Splatoon 2 and 3 sold approximately 13 and 12 million. That's a huge difference, even if we just don't count one of the Switch games. Nintendo is a company known for its many long-running IPs, as I'm sure you know. Mario has existed for over 40 years, while Zelda is getting close to 40 years. And Pokemon is also a few decades old now, even though technically it is one of the newer IPs that Nintendo has there. So Splatoon is kind of a breath of fresh air for the company. Interestingly, it's probably one of the most family-friendly shooters in existence that is also successful. I think that itself is an accomplishment. But its deep lore, interesting art style, music, artistic direction, and very refined gameplay makes it an attractive game to play for pretty much every age group. I think Splatoon is such a great thing for Nintendo, and the Switch really brought it to the masses. And when you think about it, Splatoon probably sold a fair amount of online subscriptions, which I'm sure Nintendo was thrilled about, unlike all of us who had to pay for it, or your parents who had to pay for it. Some of you may not expect this, but the Switch proves also that games don't necessarily sell consoles. Nintendo essentially looked at all the games they made for the Wii U, like Mario Kart 8, Breath of the Wild, Super Mario Bros. U, Super Mario 3D World, and others, and then they said, hey, we spent a lot of money developing this stuff. And they're all great games. Most of the Switch buyers haven't even played these, so let's just port them over and add a few things, and they'll essentially be new games for those people. And then we save a ton of development money at the same time. They were very much criticized for doing this, but then think about who the critics were here. People who had Wii U's, or, video game journalists. Most people, though, didn't have a Wii U, so it didn't really apply to them, did it? In fact, if you look at these games, they're all highly celebrated, so there you go. The saying that good games sell systems isn't always true, or else the Wii U would have sold a lot. You have to have a good lineup, but having a good lineup doesn't guarantee success. I think that's the main point. There's more variables at play. In terms of influencing the gaming industry, the Switch really opened up opportunities for other companies unintentionally. While it served as a proof of concept for this kind of device, its shortcomings, mainly the lack of power and also online stuff, led to devices like the Steam Deck, the Asus ROG Ally, and Lenovo Legion Go. While those sorts of things existed before and would have existed without the Switch in some way, I think the Switch made a lot of people go, hey, I want something like this, but more powerful. Indirectly, it also seems to spur the development of video game streaming, but I'm not really into that. I mean, I'm sure it'll get better over time. It's already way better than it used to be. But anyways, out of all of those, the Steam Deck seems like the most successful device of that category. In a way, it's become its own console, despite being essentially a portable extension of the PC gaming world. The point is that game developers make games with the Steam Deck in mind and pay attention to how it will run on it. So that's kind of the big deal there. I do wonder how collectors and retro gamers are going to look back at the Switch in the future. I think as a collector's item, the Switch is probably going to do quite well, but then every Nintendo device seems to. The system also benefits of plenty of physical releases, often interesting ones. You know, they have done like interesting pack-in things with the games, like Breath of the Wild got like a starter book thing, and Splatoon 2 had like a little bundle with like a book or something and stickers. And then the console itself is interesting because you can, of course, configure it in different ways in terms of how you want to play it. And then there is various versions of the hardware too. You know, the regular one, the Switch Lite, and the one with the OLED screen. Then there's several limited edition ones, like for example that Splatoon OLED Switch, which I have. I'm guessing that prices won't be that expensive for a while for the used hardware because there's so much hardware floating around, and the Switch 2 can play Switch 1 games, so, you know, that itself is going to probably keep used prices down for at least another console generation. When I see keep prices down, I mean like, you know, in context. I don't think we'll ever see, you know, Switches selling for 10 or 20 bucks like back in the day when you can get Nintendo DS Lites for like $15 or something. The thing is though, games are quite expensive for the Switch, like if you want to get some used ones. We've already seen this developing for several years now. I guess physical print runs aren't as large as they used to be for all the games, so eventually they just sell out after a couple of years. Certain games, even really popular ones, I haven't seen them on the shelves in years. Like for example, Astral Chain or Xenoblade Chronicles 2, or that expansion that they did for it. The exception seems to be super successful Nintendo games, which makes sense. Another collectability aspect is the accessories side of things. There's interesting things here and there, various controllers. You know, the Joy-Con, they have different colors. There's Pro controllers, which have various versions as well in terms of their designs. And then there's those official NES and SNES controllers for the Switch too. Or sorry, for the Switch as well, I should say. It gets confusing. And of course, the GameCube controller just never dies either, does it? The more rare official stuff is obviously going to be the cool stuff to have as a collector. So, you know, if you look at things like Nintendo Labo, I think that's going to be on the list of things that are going to be cool to have as a collector. It's something that everybody knows about, but over time, I think, you know, young people who are young and never had a Switch, they'll probably not know what Labo is and be like, what the hell? They did this thing? That's cool. You know, it'll be seen as an interesting historical curiosity, and it won't be criticized as much as, you know, many people have when it actually came out as being, you know, basically overpriced cardboard is, you know, that's the argument people have been making about it. But that's just how it is, right? The older things get, the more interesting and quirky they become for collectors to own. For retro gamers, I'm not sure how the system will hold up. That's something that, I guess, changes over time, and it depends on many things like system durability, ease of repair, parts availability, the state of modding, and not to mention whether an alternative device is available. The Switch 2 being that alternative device, especially when it becomes discontinued. I know that seems far off because it's not even out yet, but I'm just thinking of how things were with other consoles in the past. Like, for example, people were playing GameCube games on the Wii because there's way more Wiis than GameCubes. And it had the advantage of not needing an expensive component cable for component output like the GameCube. And also other examples are like, you know, the DS being able to play Game Boy Advance games, or how you didn't need an original Game Boy and Game Boy Color because you could just use a GBA, or if you used a GBA SP, on top of color, you also had a lit screen. So something like that may arise with, the Switch. I find it interesting that in the future, the lack of power of the consoles just doesn't really matter. It just becomes part of the charm and even the identity of the system. People who grew up with certain consoles just want to relive, that experience. So that's why some people don't even want to have emulators where, it improves on textures and stuff. They just want to play it exactly how they did it back then. And that includes, the slowness and the frame rates and all that. They just want it to be accurate. And I can kind of understand that. Like, for example, I grew up with an Amstrad CPC 6128. So, for example, the game Ikari, I just want to play the Amstrad version, even though the arcade version is way better looking and even the controls are different. So, the Amstrad port is obviously inferior, but that's the one I want to play. Now, in terms of some of the more negative things the Nintendo Switch will be known for, I think the biggest one is probably Nintendo Switch Online. Because as a consumer, you feel like you're forced to purchase that subscription. It's the first Nintendo subscription service. It doesn't really have that many features. They do include, obviously like the old games and all that stuff, but I just don't like how games you could buy in the past are now a subscription service. I'd rather own something than subscribe to something in order to have a license to play it. The Switch was never really that powerful either. Like I said, that's not unique to the Switch when it comes to the world of Nintendo or consoles in general. So I don't think that's just, people will not really focus on that in the future. Because of the success and its form factor, I think the Nintendo Switch will be one of those consoles that defines the generation. It'll be a bit like the Wii. It's kind of old and underpowered hardware, but reconfigured in a way that makes something interesting. It provides an experience that you couldn't really get anywhere else. And surely in the future, the Switch will be a supplier of nostalgia for people who grew up with it in a similar way the Wii does. So yeah, that's what I think about the Nintendo Switch. Let me know what you think about the system in regards to what you think its legacy will be like. And also just some general comments there if you have some interesting points to make about the Switch. I hope you found the video interesting. Remember to check out the channel membership or Patreon page if you want to see various ways to support the channel. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you again in the next video.